Halo Kridian, saat ini saya sedang berada di Gedung A, Kampus 1, Lantai 7, Ruang 712 Ukrida. Saat lagi kita akan menyaksikan guest lecture yang bertemakan From Postcolonial to Transcultural Literature yang diadakan bersama Jonathan Moore dari Eastern Illinois University. Selamat menyaksikan.
So in this second session, Mr. Jonathan Moore will give lecture on transcultural and neocolonialism. Please welcome Mr. Jonathan Moore.
I want to take a step back before we do that. Before we get into the next thing, as it's trying to connect quickly, it's searching for my computer. Yeah, good. Let's go over kind of what we've talked about, and this was an interesting experiment, so I thank you guys for being flexible on lunch in the accrued. Remember we were doing that like 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago? I was curious, were you able to figure out who the Eucretians were at all? Did you see anything odd in behavior about other people? I was a Eucretian for a while, at least until I gave up, while I was eating with some of you. I don't know if you saw how I was eating or what I was doing, at least when I was communicating with you. Any of you that were not Eucretians, did you pick up on traits? Okay, so maybe this wasn't the activity. Did you figure out? Yes, you did? Okay, what did you think was one of the traits? Sharing food. If you were a Eucretian, one of the rules that you were supposed to do was before you eat, you need to offer something to eat from somebody else. Would you like a bite of this? So I was walking up to some of you, and you were very polite. You were very kind to the weird white guy who was trying to get fruit into your mouth. And so that was one of the rules, was before you eat, that was a basic cultural norm. And it's not uncommon for a lot of places, no, I don't eat first, I offer someone else. I don't know if you've ever been in a culture where they force feed you. Coming from Ethiopia and Eritrea, the rule was stop eating before you are full. Because Ibu, whoever made the meal, will probably come to you and say, no, you are so hungry, and the fingers would be down your throats before you do it. And realize that this was all finger food and hygiene wasn't really particularly high on the list. But you knew you just needed to say, oh, I'm full, no matter what, and then accept 1 or 2 bites. So one of the ideas was, hey, there are plenty more chairs. You guys don't feel like squishing together, but maybe that's even crucial. Yeah, you guys can sit wherever. I don't mind if you squeeze in. So anybody else have any of the other rules for your crew? You needed to offer something.
They eat with left hand.
Oh, they eat with their left hand. Did you guys notice that? Did you guys see the Eucretians eating with left hand? That wasn't a rule. That wasn't a rule that was given. Now, one of the problems that I ran into, I'm sorry, tell me your name. Henry. One of the problems that I ran into was I made Henry into a Eucretian. Henry wasn't eating. And so if you were looking towards Henry, Henry may have been a perfectly well-behaved Eucretian. But because he wasn't eating, he didn't need to offer food to anybody else. So even though he was part of the culture, you wouldn't have known that he was part of the culture based on the behavior. And that happens a lot when you're trying to adjust to a new culture. I don't know who you watched, but you may have seen someone eating with their left hand and realized this person must be a Eucretian. We call those false cues or individualized behaviors. Even though you're Indonesian, and even though you behave like an Indonesian, there are certain things that you do that your friends don't. There are certain behaviors that you just choose to have because that's who you become. And so not all the habits that you notice are going to necessarily be fully shared cultural behaviors. Anybody catch any of the other traits for the behaviors? So they needed to ask for food, or you needed to ask somebody else if they wanted to eat. What else? Huh? You were supposed to have eye contact. You were supposed to maintain eye contact while you were eating if you were a Eucretian. So that's a challenge. You may not have noticed that because you're also looking at your own meal. And then the third one was you were supposed to touch someone whenever you were eating. And so I was not real comfortable with that as I was offering you food, because I'd be coming up to you as a stranger, offering you something to eat, and touching you on the arm, or brushing up against you, or kind of shoving my butt towards you. And so you've got those elements of it. I've used this activity in a couple of different ways for different courses and when students are going abroad. It's a real challenge to adapt to a new culture. And so if you're going abroad, it is hard to go ahead and figure out what's a norm and what's just a personality behavior. When I came to Indonesia, my mentor had been here for 30 plus years. And so he told me immediately, you never, as an American or as an Indonesian, walk out in short pants. Never, never. Even if they're nice shorts, even if they're dressy shorts, even if you're wearing batik with them, you never go out with shorts. What I found out was in Salatiga and in Semarang, where both places are not quite Jakarta hot, but they're hot, was that my generation, not his, but my generation and the younger people, it wasn't uncommon to wear shorts. If you went to the hardware store, and I spent a lot of my time rebuilding a couple of houses, if you went to the hardware store, it wasn't uncommon to see somebody go to the hardware store and wear shorts, even if they were Indonesian. We also live in what's considered we lived at the time in what's considered one of the most Chinese neighborhoods in one of the most Chinese cities in Indonesia. And Semarang has a high Chinese Indonesian population, especially for its size. And so among the Chinese Indonesians, the behaviors had different norms than necessarily by the true Javanese. If they were Javanese Christian Chinese, then their behaviors might have been different. If they were Javanese Muslim Chinese, which there were a handful, their behaviors were different still. And so trying to identify what those differences are is important if you're going. From a post-colonial perspective though, what you need to understand is that even if I gave everyone the rules, and they knew what the rules were, even if I said, everybody, act like a Ukrainian, and I gave everybody the same set of rules, and I said, you need to ask other people before you eat, you need to look at them in the eye, and you need to go ahead and touch them at some point. Some of you would have followed that some of the time. And eventually, some of you would have stopped doing that. You would have gotten distracted, you would have said, no, this is silly, you would have just decided I'm bored, you would have just forgotten that you were supposed to. And so others would have incorporated that, and if I did this long enough, every meal for the next month, you need to eat like a Ukrainian, when you're with your mom and dad, when you're at home, when you're with your friends, when you're at Burger King, you need to eat like a Ukrainian no matter where you're at. After a month, some of you, even when I said the experiment is done, might find yourself sitting a little closer to somebody else and touching them just a little bit. You might have unexpectedly and just automatically been asking, do you need something to eat? Would you like a piece of this? For some of you, it would have been forgotten, and some of you, it would have become automatic. And so, when we talk about colonial conditioning, some of that colonial conditioning comes and stays. It sticks. Some of it doesn't. And that's one of the things that I want you guys to be aware of. The best colonial conditioning, the strictest, the most scientific approach to colonial conditioning only gets you so far. You can teach your children, this is how you behave, and I guarantee that at some point you will be shocked because, oh, we don't do that in our family. You know that. Oh yeah, I do, but I forgot. Or I do know that, but I thought it was stupid, and so I decided to disobey you. So that's the perspective that I want you guys to take from that. I don't come without gifts, because Indonesians don't come without gifts. Shortly before Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Some of you guys have read Frankenstein. And those of you that were listening to us in the corner can't respond to this if you guys overheard this discussion. Can anyone tell me the name of the Indonesian volcano that blew up before Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that helped create the conditions for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? Not Krakatoa. Big volcano out east, created the summer that never was in the United States. It created zombie-like conditions in much of Europe. And so when Mary Shelley and her husband were walking through the fields in Europe, and they saw the poor and the desolate, people who were starving. What did I hear? I thought I heard one. Tambora. Whoa! I want you guys, when you're approaching literature, to realize this I picked up the other night, just here in Vermedia. I was hoping to go to the bookstores, Paraplus, in the airports, but I didn't manage to squeeze a visit into those. I've recently been reading some articles about this Gothic novel of Frankenstein, taken really from a post-colonial or colonial perspective. Just because it doesn't fit Chinua Achebe or Romudia Nandor, whose name I can't pronounce despite 10 years. Romudia? Yes, that guy. Even though you may not be looking at one of those authors, you need to be thinking about that post-colonial, neo-colonial, and colonial elements can be found in a lot of other texts. And so be willing, especially, I'm hearing about scripsies, and I'm excited. Because the scripsies that I'm hearing are not, let's talk about Romeo and Juliet again. They're not covering materials that you can look up on Google and find 200,000 sites saying the exact same thing that you're hoping to say in your scripsy. I want you guys to be looking at literature in a different kind of way. This is one of the ways that I want you guys to be looking past. Achebe is brilliant. Ngugi is brilliant. Soyinka, Tor. The colonialist writers are smart. But earlier today, when I asked you guys, do you remember what it was like when the Dutch were in control? Of course not. You don't. And there's a problem with this idea of using the term post-colonial. For a long time, and really still now, I don't believe in post-colonialism. I use that term, post-colonialism, but I don't think that it's an accurate term. And that really does sound so bold, because I'm not Ngugi or Achebe or those guys. But I want to give kind of a logic for why post-colonialism as a term has at least some problems. You could probably justify it and probably persuade me to change my mind on that. But I want you to open your mind a little bit to the idea of the problem with post-colonialism. Are we really past the post and post-colonialism? This is the problem that we're addressing. The first problem is that post really implies that pre, and a return to that pre, is possible. So we talk about post-colonialism and we talk about the problems of how the colonists have changed Indonesia. How the British influence has made you into something that Indonesia isn't or shouldn't be. So if today we tried to knock down all the Dutch buildings in Indonesia, if today we banned, what are the really sweet, oh there's some really good, there's some really great Dutch food that we get in Jateng. Some really great sweets, and we said, Dutch bakeries, go on. Dutch food, go on. Dutch influence, go on. Any name that comes from the Dutch. So the street names that you may be using, the Gereja Belondok in Semarang, we're going to go ahead and get rid of that. We're going to get rid of the architecture, we're going to get rid of the names, we're going to get rid of the food, the influences, and of course the language. We've got to get rid of the language. We're going to get rid of all of that colonial occupation that is so apparent in Indonesia. What's that going to leave us with? Are you going to, next week, so today, we do it. We knock them all down, we change it all out, we destroy it all, we get rid of it all, we ban it all. Next week, are you going to be able to return to the same culture that your great-grandparents had before the Dutch came here? Are you going to be able to return to that? Because the idea that we could return to a culture that existed before, as it existed before, is wrong. We can't do that. Culture is dynamic. That one of the basics of all cultural understanding is that culture continues to change. And there are some cyclical elements. There are some elements that we see returning. If you think about fashion and the styles that you you've got, you see them returning. I find it hilarious when I see some of my college students wearing shirts that say The Smiths, or Metallica, or Led Zeppelin. And I realize the fact that, no, that's my generation, or even before my generation. And so if you're wearing a Smiths t-shirt, I'm going to come up and talk to you. I'm going to talk to you about, oh yeah, man, do you love this album? Or let's talk about Johnny Rotten, or let's talk about different people from that same era. Let's dig into when I was a kid and the music that I was growing up with. It didn't come back the same way. It doesn't evolve back and return that way. We may have influences. We may have ideas. Om tela om, which I refer to as om toilet om. It's my bad pronunciation, not an Indonesian thing. It's not anything new. Growing up, the way that the horns in America work is there was normally a rope along the big trucks. And so you would do this symbol along the side of the road, and you would try to get the guys to honk their horn. You do this to the truckers, and they honk their horn, and you yay and cheer, and things like that. So it cycles through, it does. You need to understand that some of the foundations of culture, absolutely, it comes back. But it never returns to the way that exactly it was. And so you can try to reinitiate it. Look at the language approaches that people have tried throughout the world. Eritrea and Kenya. Look at Paris. And Paris has said, what we're going to do is we're going to ban non-French words. So you don't order a Big Mac at McDonald's, because those aren't French words. And so it's the Ministry of Letters, is that what it is? Do you know? There's a ministry that's in charge. There's a group that's in charge of language and culture. And I don't know it in French. But, oh, see, I'm going to my French expert back. Yay, she doesn't know it either. Okay, now I don't feel stupid. She's more French than I am. But there are groups that try to do that. You'll hear politicians, you'll hear religious leaders, you'll hear political leaders, you'll hear teachers and parents that are saying, we need to save our culture. Or man, they start getting nostalgic. And they start throwing around this idea of our culture would be so much better if we returned to where we were. As much as we can criticize the negative changes brought about by colonialism, we can't return to a pre-colonial culture. We can limit their influences, and we'll get into what we can do, but we can't return to that culture. It doesn't exist anymore. It's because culture is dynamic. There's a second problem with post-colonialism. Post-colonialism assumes that colonialism has ended. It assumes that just because the Dutch left, the Dutch are no longer influencing you. It assumes that just because the British left Kenya or Tanzania, or the Italians left Eritrea, or the French have left much of West Africa, that it implies that their influence isn't still being felt. It's not true. I want to introduce you guys to somebody. This is my dad. This is my father. It's not really much of a joke. When my kids see this guy from Up, Mr. Fredrickson, my father's name is Fred, by the way, Mr. Fredrickson, when they see Mr. Fredrickson, my kids say, Poppy, it's Poppy. Now if I scrunch over a little bit, if my glasses were just a little bit more square, look at the nose, look at the jowls, look at the hunch, that's who I'm going to be one day. This really does look like my dad in so many different ways. I haven't lived with my father for over 20 years now. 25 years, really. I left for college and I come home a little bit, but not even for summer vacation. So I see my folks for weeks at a time, and yet when you hear me talk, you hear my father's voice. When you hear me argue about silly things, you really hear my father's personality come out. My father's sense of humor, oh, I tell the worst bad dad jokes now. And my son is picking up on that. He says, you sound like Poppy. And so even though I've been out of the house, even though my father has not controlled my life in over 25 years, I'm still my father's son. And so the idea that he is no longer influencing me. When I say something to my wife, sometimes I catch myself and say, that's something my dad would say. I should never say that again, ever. And there are other times where maybe I do something and I realize, you know what, that kind of makes me happy because my dad would do something like that. Or that would make my dad proud to see me do that. And so my dad's influence is still there. He's thousands of miles away in the United States with me, and yet I'm still being controlled, changed, influenced by my father. The cultural influences are still present, even though we've ended them. The direct and obvious national colonialism has evolved. It has changed. That when Hong Kong was given back to the Chinese, did it immediately become a Chinese culture again? Absolutely not. Are there still really British elements of Hong Kong? There are still a ton of British elements throughout Hong Kong, and the way that they think and the way that they operate. Their streets, their buildings, their architecture, their music, their art, all of it is still being impacted by the British, despite having, what, now 15 plus years, almost 20 years of independence from Britain. Was it 99 that their lease ran out? So we have this idea, it hasn't ended. And this is where we start getting into the fun discussions. That colonial influence really has not ended. Instead, it's just evolved. How has it evolved? One of the things that we've seen is more and more cultural appropriation. Remember the early goals of colonization? The first goal of colonization is exploitation of resources. That's one of the goals, is how do we profit? What's in it for me by colonizing these people? And so we moved to the idea of instead of simply taking the land, taking the resources, exploiting for profit, we take culture. And you get cultural appropriation. That term, cultural appropriation, is simply taking a cultural element from another group and misusing it, or using it in a way that does not have the same cultural meaning from the original culture. So, the largest supplier in the world of batik shirts. What country produces more batik shirts than any other right now? What country? No, Indonesia does not sell more batik shirts than anywhere else. Malaysia doesn't sell more batik shirts. China sells more batik shirts, or makes more batik shirts than anyone else right now. It may not be good batik. It may not be real batik. It may have Disney characters or Manchester United incorporated into it. But China's taking the idea. You've seen the advertisements for Apache cigarettes, the Native American symbol, and yet that cultural symbol of the Native American brave has been appropriated to sell cigarettes in Indonesia. Tobacco was introduced to the New World by the British. It was never a Native American staple. It was never something that was part of who they were. And so we talk about cultural and sometimes even physical appropriation of resources. And so we'll take, so that instead of it being a direct colonial control, we've got people controlling cultural elements, reselling them, remaking them. I recently heard about the, what are we calling it? The chork, the chopstick fork. So it's got chopsticks on one side and fork prongs on the other. And so this cultural element that's been viewed for centuries as a Chinese culture has gone ahead and been modified and changed. And so it's no longer just something for Chinese culture, but it's something to be used elsewhere. I ate at Pomodoro's last night. And Pomodoro's is an Italian restaurant that came to Indonesia from Tokyo. Yeah, and so they got a big sign on the wall that over at the mall. they've got a big sign explaining that it came from Japan because it was opened there based on pasta, which is an Asian element. You know, certainly we talk about me, and so we've got this idea, but this cultural appropriation. Sometimes it's more physical. So the United States puts a military base in the Philippines, or has a major base in Japan or in Germany and other places. And so we begin to go ahead and appropriate the space, and it may be through legal means, but we're still present, and we're still influencing those populations. If you look at the #1 spreader of AIDS and sexually transmitted diseases, the #1 way to get a new sexually transmitted disease to pop up in your country is to invite the UN to help. And what we see are young men who are brought in to help fight a war, to help recover after a natural disaster. And they bring with them lots of money and lots of boredom and a desire for women. And so they spread diseases through prostitutes and things like that. And so we've got this real negative influence, and it's a virus, and it spreads because we've got this population of appropriation moving in and still exploiting the population, but doing so in different ways. Yes, they're spending money on alcohol or buying batik or, you know, going ahead and going to movies and things like that. But at the same time, they're influencing the local culture in a lot of ways and exploiting it wherever they can. Not always intentionally, often unintentionally. We saw this in Haiti. We've seen this throughout most of Africa. That these pockets where the UN end up setting up shop spread. For a long time, there was talking about Americanization as something that followed post-colonialization. McDonald's is taking over the world. And more recently, it's been Starbucks and Nike, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, those kind of products. After we moved past this idea of colonization, and in the 1960s, when it was clear that England had really lost their hold and most of the political powers in the world were, in one way or another, giving up formal control of their colonies. They still exist. There are still colonies out there. But for the most part, it's been frowned upon by the global community. We say, okay, they're going to go ahead and release Hong Kong. It's really profitable. They certainly had to release India, less of a choice, more of a direct action. And other places throughout Africa, we've said independence. How can we be fighting to give people freedom and then be taking it through our colonies? And so we talked about this Americanization idea. There are a few of you that I can't do this with. Normally when I bring up this example, I point out the fact that I am the most Indo-Asian in the room. Because I'm wearing batik. And I'm only seeing a little bit of batik on you guys. Yeah, there's some. I'm saying that there's some. But oftentimes I'll do this example and I'll look around the classroom and I'll see Nike tennis shoes, or I'll see an emblem of a rock group across the shirts. I'll look around and I'll see Chinese and I'll see American clothes, and I don't see, you guys aren't wearing cartoon hair right now. You guys are embracing your culture. This idea of Americanization, though, was the worry that America is going to continue to take over the world, and you guys are going to look like any other American anywhere. By the way that you dress, you guys are taking English classes. And how do you know if you are good in English? You sound like me. And so the idea was, and we're still talking about this some, is that more and more people were going to simply homogenize, become like the Americans. We're going to eat Big Macs, you're going to wash it down with a Starbucks, you're going to be wearing your Nike tennis shoes, you're going to turn on the radio and you're going to be listening to, I don't know, Miley Cyrus. You're going to listen to, sorry, I'm old. These are my reference points. Sometimes it's a little out of touch. Yeah, you may be listening to other people, you may be listening to, I don't know, Keith Urban, you're listening to country music, you're listening to Lady Gaga. You little monsters that you are. So this is one of the places that post-colonialism and the concern over post-colonialism moved to. We moved to this idea of Americanization. So maybe, if we're no longer post-colonial, maybe we need to start talking about Americanization. There's a problem with that. Is that Americanization implies that American culture is going out and influencing, but Americans themselves are not being influenced. It also implies that there's only one power that's doing that. If I said the word K-pop, clearly, it's not just Americans that you're being influenced by. Pen, pineapple, pineapple. It's not just Americans that you guys are being influenced by. We could talk about the French influences of food. We could talk about Lebanese opportunities. We could talk about Pomodoros, the Tokyo-based Italian restaurants. We could talk about all of these other influences that will pop up. And so it may be in heavy metal, and you're listening to all the really great heavy metal bands, like Rammstein and people like that, all come out of Germany. But we've got all of these different influences popping up. And so we realize that it's not just about Americanization anymore when we talk about what has colonization evolved into. It's evolved into something else. It's evolved into globalization. And globalization argues that instead of just one culture influencing everyone else, it's not just a starting point going out, but instead it's mutual and it's a back and forth. For a long time, the #1 condiment, the #1 extra thing that you would put on your burgers and put on your food in America was sauce tomate. What we would call ketchup, but I don't want to confuse you guys. But sauce tomate was the #1 condiment in America, the #1 extra that you kind of cover your food in. You kind of add to your food. A few years ago, it became salsa. So, a Mexican blend of spices. And then it became sriracha, a really hot spicy. That we've got like a chave kind of sauce. That was really a nice hot spicy flavor. And so globalization wasn't just about America influencing others, but we were seeing people come out and singing songs in Korean on American radio. We were seeing Hispanic musicians taking on more and more of a role. Shakira. These hips don't lie. And that idea. South American influences were sneaking into music. Hip-hop influences. We're careful about what my children listen to, but one of my favorite bands that my son has gotten into is a beatboxer by the name of Mattis Yahoo. And Mattis Yahoo sings kind of in a Bob Marley kind of style, but it's hip-hop and beatboxing. And Mattis Yahoo is an Orthodox Jew. And so he's this Jewish beatboxer who sings like Bob Marley. And it's influencing America. Oh, it's cool stuff. If you guys have not gotten into it, this guy is the most Christian Jew I've ever heard before. He's just that close to being able to understand what Christians are going after. Really deep songs, but really talented voice. He can do things. And he's sung with Sting and the Police. He's sung with people who are singing after Bob Marley. He's won all sorts of awards. But he shows that the influence isn't just coming from one place. Our fashion styles. I attended a wedding a few years ago in Texas, the heart of American culture. And all the bridesmaids, all the women standing up with the bride, were wearing Indian saris, the outfits of India. Because these white girls who'd grown up in Texas thought that this was the style that was really cool. You look at Gwen Stefani, and you look at Gwen Stefani's influences as a musician, and you see that the styles that she uses. You look at anybody who's up on stage, anybody who used to be a Disney star but became something else, and you see their styles pulling from all of these different cultures. And we've got this idea of globalization. But all of that moves to this idea of the term that I like to use instead of post-colonialism. And that is neo-colonialism. New colonialism. That's all that it is. And new colonialism argues that yes, colonialism still exists, but it exists in a different way. Neo-colonialism encompasses a lot of these terms. Cultural appropriation, Americanization, globalization. There's some other terms that we'll start throwing out as well. But this is still very much a cultural term that is evolving about what does neo-colonialism really look like. It certainly involves the way that you are dressing. Because realize the way that you're dressing says something about your beliefs, values, and attitudes. The term cultural artifact. A cultural artifact is anything, action, movement, or behavior that carries with it culture. A cultural artifact. When you dress in a certain article of clothing, it says something about you. How high the collar is, meaning how much skin are you showing here? How high the pant legs are. I can tell Indonesians who are from flood zones, because most Indonesians who are from areas where they panjir, they wear their pants a little bit higher. Because it just makes sense. But it says something about what you're concerned about, doesn't it? It says something what you're worried about, and what's not important to you, and how you show respect or how you don't show respect. A few years ago, I would have never gone to a funeral or been to a funeral where people were wearing blue jeans. Denim, that they're wearing denim pants. But now it's become a much more culturally accepted behavior. The influence of blue jeans is certainly shaping even the idea of power distance here, and even the idea of how do you show respect. You get dressed up nice. You show respect by what you wear. Wait a minute, maybe you shouldn't show respect by what you wear, but you should show respect by what you do and how you behave. How many hapes are out right now? This is the good example because I make people feel uncomfortable. And so you pull out the hapes, and I'm looking around the room to see who has their hape out right now. And the use of a cultural artifact like a hape says something about normative behaviors and about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. I'm not offended. I'm not deeply offended. I'm practically Indonesian now, so I'm used to it. After 10 years, I'm used to saying that you got, and I know that if you're using your hape, you're probably looking up these terms, or you're writing down questions, or you're using it for educational purposes. Because that's the, and he's not checking Facebook on his computer back there by the camera either. But all of these cultural artifacts say something about the way that your culture is being influenced. And it's being colonized by Apple. It's being colonized by Starbucks. Sorry, I couldn't be in class on time. I had to go to Starbucks. You're telling me then that Starbucks is more important than respect as seen through time, and the use of your time. All of these things are influencing you. Your behaviors, beliefs, attitudes. So we're neo-colonialism with that way. That's a term that I think is worth pursuing when you talk about the colonial question and the problem with post and post-colonialism. The third problem. This is one that moves into where you guys are at with transculturalism. The third problem with post in post-colonialism is that it is still assuming that culture is still national, it's limited by country borders, and that it's binary. When we talk about binary, we're talking about zeros and ones. Everything is either a 0 or 1. You are either a Manchester United fan or you are an Arsenal fan. You can't be both, and you can't be neither. It's one or the other. The idea behind binary reasoning is that it must be one thing or the other. There's not a third choice, and there's no gray area. That's not true. The problem with that idea, culture is still national and binary. You run into some other terms that I want you guys to play with. The truth is that culture now transcends national borders. It's more diverse than ever before. Glocalization, not a typo. The idea of globalization. These are terms that I want you guys to play with. So if globalization is the argument that everyone is becoming alike, what do you think? What are the two words that you guys are seeing there? Global and local. Those are the two words that we're dealing with when we address the concept of globalization. Globalization is this combination of, even as we're taking global ideas, and we are incorporating them, we're incorporating them imperfectly and in a way that's adjusted to our local culture. When you go to McDonald's, what do you order at McDonald's? Chicken and rice. Right. Absolutely. But what I'm saying, you can get Kirkadell at KFC. Go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and you order Kirkadell. You ask an American who's worked at KFC all their lives in deep central Illinois what a Kirkadell is, and they're going to say, I have no idea. Do you want mashed potatoes and gravy or what? Biscuits, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans, corn on the cob. That's what KFC serves. But they don't here. And you can't get chicken and rice, at least not chicken on the bone, in American McDonald's. When the Chinese New Year comes around, you can order a prosperity burger at McDonald's. Hot pepper beef, right? Instead, the American equivalent, and it's not something you would get here, is the McRib sandwich. Pork meat pressed into this weird, it kind of looks like they're bones, but they're not bones. Kind of looks like it. Got barbecue sauce on bun. But it wouldn't sell in Indonesia. Why? Why would the McRib not sell in Indonesia? Be obvious. Why would this great barbecue pork sandwich not sell in Indonesia?
Because it's haram.
It's halal, it's haram, right. It's not halal, it's haram. Okay, there we go, difference. It's not going to sell here. They're not going to sell it here at all. McDonald's in India. Think about what you know. McDonald's sells what? McDonald's sells, what meat does McDonald's sell more of? Most of. Beef, right? Right? McDonald's sells beef. I mean burgers, right? They sell chicken, they sell fish. What's the problem with trying to open a McDonald's in India? You've got the idea that the cow is sacred. And the cow is sacred to me too, but usually when it's served on a bun with barbecue sauce. There are cultural differences. And I don't want that to come out as an insult. I really don't. There are key cultural differences. So how do we do it? How do we end up selling McDonald's to people who don't eat pork? Or selling McDonald's to people who don't eat beef? Or selling McDonald's, how do you sell McDonald's to a population that may be vegetarian? You do. You do. Tofu burgers. So you got tofu that tastes like beef, or looks like beef, or shaped like beef. You sell French fries, you sell salads, you sell other things, and you localize it. You combine that down. 10 years ago, my wife decided maybe I was getting a little too big. Maybe I was just getting a little too heavy. And my doctor said you can't eat like a college student anymore. And when we moved to Indonesia, she decided we needed to become selectarians. It's a great word. Selectarians is not quite vegetarian, but we're selective about how much meat we eat. And so my baked potato that used to have loads and loads of chili, of meat and beans, kind of a barbecue-y sauce thing, became a tofu baked potato. And barbecue tempeh on a baked potato makes a pretty good substitute for American chili. So we globalized. We took an international idea, or an idea from America, baked potato, pretty standard meal, and we went ahead and adjusted it to the local behaviors. Go to Pizza Hut. Go to Pizza Hut, and you can get a tofu stuffed crust. You can get tofu in the crust instead of cheese or sausages. And that's globalization, or localization. Taking a global product and localizing it. So the batik shirt that you may be wearing may have Disney characters on it. I may decide I need to be polite and dressed up when I have students over for Nathalan, We have a big Natalon party, anywhere from 30 to 130 students at my house every year. You guys are now invited if you're in Salatiga around Christmas and you hear about the Natalon. Come to my house. But it's hot, and it's crowded, and it's the rainy season. And so I take my batik shirt, and I put on my Santa hat to be culturally appropriate for the season, and I wear my shorts. I take the style of the shorts and the Santa hat, and I add the batik, I localize it. I know that some people need to be going out. No, you're fine. Okay, guys, if you need to go to accreditation, you are not offending me, and I don't think I'm scaring you off. Thank you for telling me that. I'll give him a second. No worries. That's the suit jacket. Ah, I get it.
Bye.
The good news is that now there are less people to win the next two books. So, yeah, I don't mind if you guys need to leave, you need to leave, but let's keep moving. No worries. Are we going or staying? I can try to fight through it, but it might make sense to wait. Okay, no worries. Just making sure that if we got more people popping up, then that's fine. Okay, so localization. The other thing that we're seeing is this move to third culturalization. When we talk about your first culture, we're normally talking about your passport culture. We're talking about the culture that you were born into. When we talk about second culture, at least in the courses that I teach, the working definition we use for the second culture is any other culture that you encounter and that you're forced to live into. Third culturalization, though, happens when you are not part of the first culture because you moved on, but you're not fully enculturated. You're not part of that second culture. The term originated in the 1960s, 1970s by a couple of American scholars, and they were really addressing the issue of military children. They were addressing the kids of military families from the US who might have been raised in Germany or who were raised in Japan. And so mom and dad take them at a young age and they live on or near a military base in Japan. But they're not Japanese. And they're not really Americans anymore. For some of you, if you came from a far enough place, I don't know how many of you were raised nearby. If you were raised in Jakarta, you may not be able to understand this. But if you were raised in Papua, if you were raised in Kalimantan, if you were raised in some of the other areas, when you learn enough about the new culture to begin to adjust to it, but not so much that you've completely bought into everything. You're not completely becoming enculturated into the new culture. But if you go back home, you go back to that old culture, that's not you anymore. I used the example before, my children. My children coming back to America, and they do walk into a McDonald's in America and want to order chicken and rice. Because they know that that's what you get. My son was 3 years old or so, and we had just returned from Africa. We come back from Africa, and understand that the people that I lived with in Africa and Eritrea, they're not dark-skinned. They're not black in the traditional sense. They would say, and I love the fact that one of my friends introduced herself that way. She said, "I am not black, I am cappuccino." Indonesians, you guys are cappuccino. You're not, to say that you're brown, that's not quite it. To say that you're yellow, no, that doesn't work. So you're certainly not black. And to say that you're white, this is white, or this up here. Wait, that's white. It's blindingly white. I won't show you any place else, but yeah. Kulit putih. I mean, you guys aren't white, you guys are cappuccino. So my son, we were at a hotel in the middle of, I think it was Ohio. We walked downstairs and there were a bunch of Mexican-American workers who were down there. They were getting ready for a job. They were having breakfast. A bunch of Hispanic workers. They're light-skinned, not black, not white, but kind of a brown. And my 3-year-old son was used to those people speak Tigrinya. If you're cappuccino, you guys are cappuccino, you must speak Tigrinya. You guys aren't black, you're not white, you're somewhere in between. Everyone speaks cappuccino. He didn't understand this idea of American culture norms. He didn't understand that people from Mexico would speak Spanish. Instead, he was so caught up in the second culture of Eritrea, and not quite just still an American anymore. He was somewhere in between. He was a third culture kid. Type in that word in Google, third culture kid. You're going to find a lot of really interesting information. Missionary kids, kids from international business families, kids from military families. I have a student right now named, and he's grown up, he's the least Indonesian I've ever had as an Indonesian student. Because his father's a diplomat, working out of here in Jakarta, but having grown up, I think, in Azerbaijan, as well as some other countries, as a diplomat's son. And when he decided to enroll in Indonesian university, he was the outsider in a lot of ways. He's not Indonesian, because he grew up with all of these other cultures kicking around. I have something like 12 different languages jampured in my head. High school or grade school French, high school Spanish. In college it became Swahili, Kikuyu, Turkanan. And then I moved to Eritrea where we speak Tigrinya. And then we moved over to Indonesia. And now I can say things like mango in Javanese, mongo. And I can speak a little bit of Javanese. And none of them do I speak well. But the ideas, beliefs, attitudes, the cultural foundations of all of those jampured together. And so I've got this gado-gado thing going on in my cultural head. Even the way that we speak, of code switching, of being able to jump in and use those terms. My wife was really mad the other day. We had a toucan who had screwed up something. I think it was the guttering on our roof. And she started using Amharic, which is the language of Ethiopia, where she had spent a summer. Asha, it was the term that she used. It's a little bit like bodo. To go ahead and use that kind of term. She didn't realize that when she was mad, she was using an African language that our toucan clearly had no understanding of whatsoever. And so we've got this third culturalization idea of not being part of this, but not really being part of that either. You guys are educated, and becoming more so. And if you go back to your home village, hometown, even to your parents, you are not the same as some of them, especially if you're first generation university. If mom and dad didn't go to university, you are no longer part of that cultural group that you were raised in necessarily. The other concept that I want to talk to you about too is global youth culture. Global youth culture, global, young, and the cultural groups. What we're finding, and this has been true for a number of years now, is that oftentimes you, as the global youth, have more in common with people of your same age anywhere else in the world than you do with your own parents. Think about the music that you listen to. If it's K-pop, K-pop being listened to anywhere in the world. What do you guys spend your time on? Social media? So you're searching the internet, you're playing video games, you're listening to, it may be One Direction, it may be K-pop. Does people still listen to One Direction? It may be whatever the cool boy band is of the day, be them British or American or Korean. Think about the way that you dress. And you dress, really with the exception of, actually all of you. Normally I have a couple of women wearing head coverings. And you could fit in pretty much in any university setting, almost anywhere in the world, by what you're wearing. A little bit less batik, and you'd fit into those places. To my African classrooms, to my American classrooms, to my Asian classrooms, to European classrooms, you would fit in as college students. You try to connect with your parents, and you start talking about fidget spinners. Or pen, pineapple, pineapple. What are you talking about? Even with my own kids, I'm finally at that point where I'm the old guy now. That I thought I used to be the young, cool, hip professor, but now I'm the old guy. And I can accept that. But my son will come to me and he'll start talking to me about Minecraft. Yeah, it's all about Minecraft. He's talking about zombies and he's talking about the different things and he's talking about what resources he has. I don't understand any of it. The gap has been formed between he and I about certain things. That no, we used to sit down and play video games together, then they became too complicated, he plays them alone. And so this idea of global youth culture is that you are sharing the culture of a million other people, billion other people throughout the world that you may never meet. And it goes past the borders of colonialism. The way that your culture is evolving has less to do with the Dutch and more to do with Hollywood or Bollywood or, I don't know what the Korean equivalent of Hollywood and Bollywood are. Yeah, you got the Gangnam style. Gangnam style? Yeah. You got that idea. And so you've got all of these influences. A few years ago we would have said it's the MTV influence, but now it's Starbucks. Starbucks and Oprah Winfrey are two of the largest influences on global culture. Because if Starbucks decides to sell a CD with your music on it, you're going to have listeners from all around the world. If Oprah Winfrey a few years ago said, this is the book that you need to read if you're going to be a successful person, people from all around the world are going to read Oprah Winfrey's choices. There's an entire cultural theory built around Oprah Winfrey called the Oprah effect. And it talks about how she influences global culture. Global youth culture goes way beyond cultural boundaries of national lines. So that's what we're talking about. So teach me, the last term. You guys know this probably more than I do. How would you explain what transculturalism is? Those of you that are writing for the transcultural, what's transculturalism? Tell me, say it louder. It's a combination of what?
Cultures.
It's a combination of cultures. Oh, I didn't do this. I wasn't expecting to draw on the board, and I apologize for my handwriting. This is a whiteboard. This is a whiteboard mark. We want to define culture this way. We want to go ahead and talk about somebody as having a singular cultural identity. But you don't. Because you're an Indonesian. And depending on how you define it, and I don't care which definition you use for culture, but when we talk about cultural defining, we're talking about shared beliefs, values, attitudes, behaviors, language, things like that. Some of the general terms that we use when defining culture. And as an Indonesian, you do have some similar beliefs, values, attitudes, normative behaviors, language, with other Indonesians. But that's not the only group that you're part of. We have these macro groups, these really large groups like nation states, so you're Indonesian. But you're a member of a lot of other groups. You're a member of K-popers? Is that the, can I call you guys that? For some of you, you're K-popers. Right? You guys are fans of K-pop. And so, some of those K-popers are part of Indonesia, like you guys. And some are beyond Indonesia, right? Start complicating that. Throw in things like religion. And so your religious group that fits some inside Indonesia, you're Muslim, there are lots of Muslims here. You're Christian, there are lots of Christians here. But there are also lots of them outside of the country too. Some of those, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, whatever, are K-popers. And they're Indonesian. Some aren't. We start throwing it around and we can do tons and tons of these circles as long as they are talking about who you are in terms of your groups that share beliefs, values, attitudes, norms, and language. And it's shared by somebody else. Those are your cultural groups. And so when we talk about transculturalism, I'm a Christian. I'm an American. I'm a father, and there's a whole culture of fatherhood out there. I'm a tuba player. Tuba? The really big horn. When I was a kid, I used to play the tuba. And there's a whole uniqueness to being a tuba player. All of those elements, and way beyond that, that I'm a huge fan of, I used to be a huge fan of punk music with my blue hair. This one's still, you can probably see that I've double pierced here. Yeah, when I was a kid. Huge fan of all of those cultural influences. And so we're not just dealing with one circle. Our Venn diagrams are getting really complicated because of all of the different cultural influences. And so mom and dad, because you're part of a family culture, tell you that this needs to be your #1 priority. And your teachers, because you're part of this university community, this cultural group, tell you this needs to be your #1 priority. And your religion tells you this needs to be your #1 priority. And your group of friends say, no, 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 they're all wrong. This is what we're dealing with. Transculturalism. And with that transculturalism, it's not just sharing this, but think about the Trans-Jakarta Highway. Think about that word trans, what else it implies. It's not implying just an overlap of multiple cultures, but it's implying a movement of cultures. That culture does not remain static. Culture changes and evolves. And so transculturalism also addresses this growing up, maturing, changing of cultural beliefs, values, attitudes, norms, and language. My parents would look at me and say, I haven't changed. In the 43 years I'm alive, I'm the same John that I was when I was Masi Kichu. They would say that, oh yeah, you haven't changed at all. I hope I've changed. I hope I've grown up. I hope that my values have been different than they were before. I hope I've matured. And transculturalism implies this whole change in what you believe and what kind of groups you're part of, and how your culture is being shaped by you and will continue to evolve through you. So this idea of transculturalism, I certainly wouldn't want to step on any definitions you guys have come up with, but you understand that transculturalism is an aspect of post-colonialism that ought to be discussed. Oh, that's it. So that's the issue, really, of post-colonialism. The problem that I have with post-colonialism is that we struggle with the idea that it should remain the same. We play with this concept that post-colonialism implies that it's ending, or that it's somehow gone entirely, or that we can return to it. Instead, we've got these other concepts, these other ideas that are worth playing with as an aspect of colonial control and who we are as people. Okay, do we have questions here on this? Any of these concepts that you guys aren't comfortable with, or you wrote it down and thought, I have an explanation on that, more definition? I can't even use the whip technique, the stick technique with you guys by threatening, if there was a quiz next week over this material. If I asked you, oh, do we have?
Because we are considered as terrestrial children.
Okay.
Yes. Do you have any suggestion for us? Because unfortunately, we know little of our culture heritage.
So you guys would say that you're third world? That's interesting, because from my perspective, Indonesia's second world.
Really?
Yeah. Jakarta, I grew up in the desa. Population of 1,500 people. That was my entire town. We had one gas station, we had 2 restaurants, 4 churches, and 2 bars. And so Hayworth, Illinois, population 2006 now, I think. Yeah, I consider it to be more third world than Jakarta in many ways. But we can drink out of tap too. We can drink water straight out of the sink. Third culture and third world are going to be very different. This third world deals with development, And third culture is certainly more about a cultural identity and the way that you identify which group you're part of. You can be part of a first world country and still be a third culture kid, and that's often the case. Lots of people who grew up in Geneva, Switzerland, if your family is with the UN, if your family is with the EU, that a lot of those people are going to be third culture. Because if mom and dad are going around the world to different places, you're going to have this impact. And so some places you take off your shoes, some places you don't. What do you eat for lunch? What do you eat for breakfast? Pizza is a breakfast food, right?
In Italian.
For college students, pizza is a breakfast food. At least for me. It always was. That you've got the leftover pizza. What's appropriate for eating? When is it appropriate to eat it? What's appropriate behaviors and where? The term that I don't think we used, and I don't know if it's coming up in my next discussion, code switching is a big part of transculturalism. And I think I may have that element in it. But with transculturalism, you guys are forced to code switch a lot. Third culture kids struggle with it because they either struggle with it or do it exceptionally well. Because if you're no longer just part of this culture, and you're no longer part of the new, or you're not quite part of the new culture 100%, then when you approach someone, how do you behave towards them? Do you take a Javanese perspective when you approach a teacher? Do you speak passively? So follow the passive versus active language difference in English. You're speaking to your English professor. So you've got English dynamic going on there. But she is Indonesian. Should you speak using a passive tone, or should you speak using an active tone? Speaking to your English teacher, who is Indonesian, do you use active, which is the typically English perspective, or do you use the passive, which is the typical Indonesian perspective? The scenario: do you need to make small talk with your professor, or can you say, let's talk about my grade? Is that okay? It's not okay. It's not appropriate. This is Indonesia. You can't say, let's talk about my grade, right as soon as you walk into the office. You need to be polite, right? You need to follow their culture. Or is it because she's an English teacher that you should use the direct and active approach? This is the transcultural question. It's a good question, but yeah, I don't know. I think I got off track now. Third culture and third world are two very different concepts. We talk about third language too. Other questions about this? I think the next session will actually be a little bit shorter as I start talking about kind of what to do with all of this. It's going to be more of a resource session about talking about some places that you can go and start looking at ideas for this. Why don't I give you guys 5 minutes or so? Come back, let's call it 2:15. If you need to stretch your legs, go take a break. I need a little bit of water. But so 5 more minutes, or so 2:15. We'll go ahead and do the next little bit. Okay? Yeah, Harvard, Yale, Penn State, there are a couple of others that are Ivy League schools. The Kikuyu, which Ngugi is part of, live in Kenya. They also live in what neighboring country? Nigeria? That's Soy, or that's Achebe. Wow. Okay. Not Chad. It's connected to Kenya. It touches Kenya. Okay. Kelly, maybe we'll just stay here long enough until I come up with a question you guys can answer. I'm trying to give away books. Okay. Now she there. You guys have all Google access. How do you not have this answer? question. I'll see how desperate I become later on. Okay. Eritrea is located in the northernmost part of the eastern side of Africa. What sea is on its coast? Not the Black Sea, but it's a color. Not the Black Sea, not the Yellow Sea, but it is a color. Huh? The Red Sea. Through random guessing. It's a color. Not a pink sea, it doesn't exist. Okay. You can put away the fidget spinner. You guys can fidget either ways. Normally at this point, I start apologizing to my students because I know you're squirrely. I know that you guys are getting credit for this, but I get that 4 or 5, 6 hours of a conference is a lot to pay attention to. I do want to walk through some more material with you though. I want to talk about the colonial conclusion. I've given you guys a ton of information. I've given you guys a lot of big ideas, and I know you're on your week between classes and exams, and you're doing this because, well, you have to do it, or you're here for credit. And as much as that could hurt my ego, it doesn't. I get it, because at least I have an opportunity to teach you guys some things. But I really want to talk to you about what do you do with this. If you really think that colonialism, or post-colonialism, or neo-colonialism, is something that you're interested in, where are your resources and what can you do with this? How do you, in Indonesia, really get involved with this concept of colonialism and the discussion that's involved in it? I struggled coming here, finding books about even Indonesian post-colonialism or neo-colonialism. They're hard to come by in the bookstores. There are a handful of places that you can find them. I'm always scouring the airport bookstores to get lucky and hopefully find something by Achebe or UDE. I'm going through used bookstores. We have Book Boss in Semarang. It's old, used English books. So there's some places where you can get lucky and find those things. But I want to walk through what you guys need to do. If you are thinking about, this is something you want to know about, start digging into the names that you're hearing. I use this name a lot. Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And so look it up online. Check the Wikipedia entry. I don't often tell my students go to Wikipedia, but for some of these authors, honestly, type in the word African literature or top African authors and start looking at what other people, not necessarily what you should consider, but what other people consider are the top writers. The canon, the great books of literature. Oftentimes, in the past, the canon has been determined by dead white males. It's mostly been determined by white guys who say this is what you should read. The African canon is evolving about what is the great African author. Certainly, Chinua Achebe is up there. Ngugi is up there. If you don't know Wole Soyinka, that's a great name. Wole Soyinka, W-O-L-E, and then Soyinka. Wole Soyinka is great because Wole sounds like W-O-O-L-Y, like a sheep. Ah. And if you look at Wole Soyinka, he's got this great sheep hair, this great white mop of hair. So Wole Soyinka really is woolly. Yeah, it's kind of fun. Look at Adichie. Go to TED Talks, and I'll talk about this here in a minute. But Adichie is a great author who, like several other of her contemporaries, she's on the Vogue Best Dressed list, and then the next week she'll receive a UN Humanitarian Award. Or she'll be presenting at the United Nations about sexuality and sexism and discrimination in African culture. So Adichie's the new it girl. She's a beautiful woman. She's got amazing writing. She does a lot of cool stuff. She's just a cool person that people want to hang out with. Mariama Ba Okri, Soyinka. Those are some of the names that just pop off the top of my head. But I don't pretend to be a current expert on who the new people are. You guys need to be reading. Look at the titles. What are the best African books to read? Top African titles. And look through there. You're going to find out that not every African book, and certainly not every Indonesian book, is going to be post-colonial. That if you read a lot, you're going to find out that there are horror novels coming out of Africa, that there are bad teenage romance stories, that there are love stories between the undead and the living, that there are fables and other things. There's a lot of post-colonial, but there's just a lot of stuff coming out of Africa and Asia. Some of that's going to fit into the post-colonial or the neo-colonial, and others are just going to be the novels that people are writing because that's life. And it doesn't always have to address the colonial issues. Things Fall Apart, I really recommend. A Grain of Wheat, So Long a Letter by Bob. If you haven't read Woman at Point Zero, you need to. Egyptian writing has got a really interesting dynamic because Egypt is part of what continent? That should have been the bonus question. What continent is Egypt on?
Africa?
It's Africa, but in a lot of ways, Egypt is not an African country. And in some ways, just in the same way that Eritrea doesn't quite fit the definition. There's a real split culturally between some of the North African countries, and they're almost Middle Eastern in their nature. And they almost fit more in with Saudi Arabia and other countries like that. But if you haven't read Woman at Point Zero, you need to. You can look up country lists as well, and find out the best authors coming out of that country. For me, it was Kenya, that as I was reading in Ngugi, and after I lived there for a while, I wanted to get my hands on every Kenyan writer that I could. The Gikuyu writers, the Swahili writers, the Poka. So start digging through the country lists. Find a country that you're interested in. It can be here in Indonesia. And if that's the case, start looking at ethnic groups as well. See what the best writer is from your island or from this place or from, go beyond Promudia. Promudia? Yeah, I'm always mispronouncing that word. Go beyond him and see what you can find. You guys have some power that I don't have. I can't clearly read a full-length Indonesian novel. So every Indonesian post-colonial resource that I get my hands on has been translated into English. If you can take it a step further and read it in the original Javanese, do so. If you can read it in the Mandarin, do so. If people are writing in Mandarin from here, or some of the Chinese languages from here, read through those. But certainly some of the other ethnic groups that are around, if you've got connections or have language abilities in those areas, start digging into them. They will either disappear or get translated, hopefully. But there's a good chance that a lot of these books, if they're not being read by you guys and by your generation, they will be gone. The hard copies that you are able to dig up may never find their way onto the internet. But some are. Start looking online. Short Story Day Africa on Facebook is something that I routinely get hits from. And they're producing a lot of material. They'll give sometimes short stories or portions of stories or interviews from the new African literati, the Africans who are writing and who are talking about writing. It's certainly worth Short Story Day Africa. World literature today, this goes beyond colonialism or neo-colonialism. Sometimes you're getting translation work. It's interesting when you start playing with some of these authors, because a lot of them are just writers. They're like you guys, creative writers. You're writing something that's interesting to you if you're doing it on your own and it's not a class assignment. They're writing something that you're passionate about, and it's only later on that they begin to realize that the nature of their work may have been more post-colonial or neo-colonial than they intended. And as they grew up, people like Ngugi and Achebe became more active, and they started writing more about writing. You need to dig into those. On the web, Ohio State University has a really great literary map of Africa that's worth going to, and to start playing with it. Start clicking on some things and dance around that website and look at what kind of things you can find. The other one that's listed there is the best the 100 best books of the 20th century from Africa. And it's biased, that there are certainly some authors that are not included and should be, and then there are certain authors that are included and it's hard to justify their name being brought up as often as they are. But there's some things worth digging into. Those are some of the online sources that I use. There's a lot more out there. What you're going to find, though, is that start clicking and look for links to links to links. Start going on to those hyperlinks. When you see an author's name that you're interested in, start typing that into Google or Google Scholar, and then go from there. Look at the bibliographies of the things you're reading. Take the bibliography and start dissecting that as a starting point. Go into what else is being written there. So beyond getting into the discussion, and I can put these things back up, I can give you guys the sites, I can also respond to emails pretty easily. So get into the discussion and start reading. That's my first recommendation. Start looking out at who you're reading. Ask around. You have professors here that know African or Asian writers that I've never heard of. So talk to people. If you see somebody with an African book or an Asian book that looks interesting to you, ask them who they're reading. Get online and send an email out and say, who should I be reading to you? Achebe is no longer responding to emails because he died. But authors like Ngugi sometimes respond. Ngugi doesn't like to respond. Ngugi, I believe, is not currently responding to white scholars as much anymore. He's interested in helping African scholars. I don't know what his take would be. He was in Bali a few years ago, speaking in Bali. So I think that he's certainly open to Asian connections to post-colonialism as well. But some of the authors that you're going to be reading will respond directly to you. And so you can ask them for direct questions. Joseph Conrad, you're not going to get much of a response from him either. But people who have written about Joseph Conrad are happy to do so. Find out who the top Joseph Conrad scholar is and email that person. Very few professors are in it for the money. Most professors, academics, and scholars are in it because we're interested in ideas. And we want to respond to you. We want to help out. When you get excited about something, it makes our job more fun. And so you guys need to do that. You also need to begin to identify who you are and who you want to be. If you want to understand post-colonial cultural influences, you need to have a starting point. You need to figure out, if you're going to talk about how Belanda, how Holland has influenced Indonesia, you need to figure out where your starting point is. You need to figure out, well, what is it that you actually believe? There's a great poem, and I should have connected it to it. There's a great poem that I end up using with my students called Where I'm From. And all it asks you to do, the way that I use it, is for you to fill in the blanks about where you're from in terms of the products that you use, the smells that you grew up smelling, the sounds that you grew up hearing, the stories. Where do you keep your family history? Where do you keep your family history? Who you're connected to? Do you guys have a box? Do you have a scrapbook? In your Tamu room, is there a picture of Grandma and Grandpa meeting the president, or shaking hands with somebody famous, or somebody's wedding picture? Do you have those elements? Do you have a relative that keeps your stories? The person that when you come home and you've got that big family meal, that's the person who's going to be telling you stories about great-grandma, or about the crazy uncle that nobody else will talk about. You need to start identifying who you are, and really self-exploration. I'll teach students grammar, reluctantly. I'll teach students about composition. But one of the things I like teaching students about is trying to figure out who you are. And that becomes a starting point for discussions about your culture and your beliefs and the way that you're being manipulated. But you've got to start somewhere. You've got to do self-identification about, no, this is what I really believe. I could ask you guys, do you want to be a good student? Being a good student is important, right? Is being a good student important?
Yeah.
Or is being a good student important? Start making evaluation calls. Start making decisions about being a good student is important, but if there's a really good Manchester United game on, is that more important? Is being a good student more important than being a good friend? Is being a good student being more important than being a good child to your parents? Where would you be willing to sacrifice? And where would you not? I once had a student a few years ago, and he said, I asked, so are you fasting for Ramadan? And he said, no, I'm Muslim, but I'm not fasting. And I said, so you're Muslim, but you're not fasting, okay? I said, do you go to mosque? And he says, no, I don't really go to mosque. I said, do you pray? He says, no, I really don't pray. And I said, do you feast at the end of Ramadan? He says, oh yeah, I feast, absolutely. And so we've all got those elements to us. I joked earlier about the fact that there are some Sundays where 7 a.m. Indonesian church, which is important to me. It's important to me to belong to a fellowship of Indonesians, not just to be in Indonesia, to be part of the culture, not just in the culture. But there are some Sundays where it's hard and I'm tired, and 10 o'clock church is the better choice. And so the English service is what we go to. So you need to be thinking about who you are. Cultures change and people change, and that's not always a bad thing, but you need to know where you're starting from. Realistically. What kind of person are you? What do you believe? What do you value? So you need to identify who you are and who you want to be. I want you to know how you and your people became who they are. And these are hard questions. I want you to start looking at the influencers, the manipulators, the persuaders of your life. Have you ever been asked to do a family tree? Ano to family tree? Where you're looking at mom and dad, and who mom and dad's parents were, and who their brothers and sisters were. You kind of diagram out this family tree. And eventually it comes down to you. Right? You look at grandparents, you look at great-grandparents, you try to go back as far as you can, you look for cousins and relatives. Try doing this with the important things in your life. Try doing an interest or passion tree. And this is kind of goofy and kind of a bizarro thing to offer you guys to do for this. But to start looking at, why is it that you became interested in English? Why is it, can you track your Manchester obsession or your video game obsession? Who taught you to like what you do, or to be passionate about what you do, or who you are? And who taught them? And who influenced them? And how did it channel through? Start thinking about how you are being negatively influenced. What's the worst mistake you ever made, and why did you make it? When I was 5 or 6 years old, there was a beautiful girl named Becky Ross. She was 5 or 6 too. And I was at TK. I was at preschool. And I was showing off for Becky Ross, because Becky Ross was a beautiful girl. And I was jumping around and I was being a boy, you know, trying to show how stupid I could be, how active I could be. And I was jumping around on this playground equipment, and I fell and cut my head right open. There was blood, and there was an ambulance, and it was all that stuff. She didn't think I was very cool after that. Think about how you've been influenced. I was influenced by a girl. It was the girl's fault. Like she handed me an apple and said, no, it's good, you learn stuff. And so you think about those things. How are you being influenced? Because once you get those ideas of the personal influence, start taking a step up from individual and start looking at culture. Start taking the next step and see how your people group, your ethnic group, your microculture of friends, how are you being manipulated? Really? You spent money on a fidget spinner? You got influenced into buying this little thing that just spins and spins and spins and spins, and that's what it does. You've been suckered. I mean, you've been influenced. And maybe that's a positive influence. Maybe you focus better, maybe you got more attention when you use it. Or maybe you bought in to the hype, and somebody else said, you really should do this. You saw somebody else's and you thought, oh, that'd be cool. So start identifying how you're being manipulated and being aware of it. I want you to be a mad scientist. I want you to start playing with culture. I want you to be willing to go ahead and think critically about your culture and start identifying what can change your culture. What does change your culture? Last few years, I've seen a real change in my students. My students have gotten louder. My students have gotten braver. My students have gotten more willing to accept that they don't know everything and that's okay. And therefore, they don't have to be embarrassed about it. And one of the things is because I make them be silly in class. I make them try things that they wouldn't normally try on their own. I want everybody to stand up. Hey, I want everybody to stand up. Indulge me. You guys are tired, I'm tired. We're all entertaining each other at this point. Now what I want you to do, I want you to do a couple things for me. One, I want you guys to do your best Superman pose. You're not doing that. Everybody do your, you know how Superman stands up like this, right? So feet apart, parallel, not quite that far apart. You want them to be about shoulder length, maybe a little bit further apart. Okay, feet down, hands on your hips. Not like this, like this. Shoulders back. Okay, now I want you to breathe. Now it's curious, Ted, on a TED Talk a few years ago, there was a woman and she was talking about the Superman pose. And the Superman pose, she was arguing, and there's been some conflicting evidence about this, actually increases your confidence level if you do it for 30 seconds. So when you're Malu, and you're getting ready to give your speech in front of students, or in front of your classmates, for the grade that will determine your future and whether or not you're a bum for the rest of your life, and whether or not you get to grad school, or whether or not someone loves you, you need the confidence. And so you end up being brave this way. Go ahead and sit down. You guys, yeah, thank you for indulging me on that one. But what happens when you change one part of your culture? What happens? Teeny hair, and I'm going to wear my kabaya every day to class. If you decided to go ahead and embrace those things, would it make a difference? I don't have an answer on a lot of these questions. But think about what kind of an impact it might have on other elements of your culture and other personally, and also the cultural impact that you're going to have on your classmates as well. To decide to be more conservative or less conservative, to be louder or quieter, to change some aspect of your life so that you can adjust it. Start playing with these ideas. I want you guys to be brave one other area. A lot of you, this is it. You and I will never have any more contact after today, and you're okay with that. And that's fine with it. But for some of you, you need to be willing to dig deeper. And I'm not the only resource out there. I want you to use your other resources. You have very smart professors. That's why they're professors. And that's why they got hired. You have very smart teachers here. And they know a lot, and they have a lot of answers. And they have answers to questions that I don't know, and I have answers that they don't know the answers to either. So start playing with your resources. Sometimes I may not know the answer, but I can point you somewhere else. So give me a day, and I can say, let me ask my friend at Purdue. Let me ask my friend down at UDE. Let me ask my friend over in some other place. Or yeah, I typed this in and I got a different answer than you did, so maybe you need to go to this website. I'm happy to do that. I have students apologizing when they email me at 2 in the morning. I don't always check my email at 2 in the morning, and they shouldn't expect me to. And I'm okay with that. You can email me anytime you want. I may not get around, and don't expect me to necessarily, it's 2:30 in the morning and he didn't respond to my 2 a.m. email. Not going to happen. I'm going to be sleeping most of those times. I'm up at call to prayer every morning, but even when I'm up at call to prayer, sometimes I'm not necessarily checking my email. So I want you guys to be aware that I'm a resource for you. JonathanBMoore@yahoo.com. Somewhere on Uka Esway's website, you can probably track me down. Miss Sylvia can probably track me down as well. So you can start playing with me as a resource. Pak Jomo or Jonathan P. Moore. If you're Malu and you think that your English is not good enough, write in Indonesian, please. I have Google Translate. I have some Indonesian. I understand a lot more Indonesian than I use. And since I'm teaching in English, I feel like you can get away with using mostly English to you guys. But if it's easier for me to communicate to you in Bahasa, that's fine too. We'll figure it out. Your imperfect English, my bad Indonesian, we will connect somehow. So that's what I want you guys to be aware of, is that I'm a resource for you, these ideas. Keep digging though. The cultural change that I instituted in my classes that my students were not ready for is that I don't care about your education any more than you need me to. I want all my students to do well. But I'm not going to push them. I'm not the one getting a grade, and I'm not the one determining what you should be interested in. But if you show interest to me, if you tell me, Mr. Moore, could you help me? I'm right there. If a student wants to fail my class, I let them fail my class. But if a student wants to pass my class or get an A in my class, and they're willing to work at it, I'm right there. That goes with any student, whether you're at my campus or not. That if you want my help and have gotten to dig deep into information and want to do it, I get excited by that. I want to do that. I want to help you guys. So let's work on it together as a community of learners. That's what I really want to go for on that. So use me as a resource. Use your other professors as a resource. You all have smartphones. They're only smart if you use them. So there's a ton of information out there. Sometimes you just need to figure out where to find it. Okay, that's really the bulk of what I'm presenting today, but it's a big one. Therefore, it must be a good book. It must be a good book. It's Ron's copy. It's copy. Ernest Hemingway. Oh, Steve, I don't know who Ernest Hemingway is. Okay. Ernest Hemingway fought in World War I. He worked in World War I, so I didn't fight in World War I. Before the U.S. was there. What was his job in World War I? Huh? Oh, you know what Hemingway's job was? Have you discussed it already? What is it? What did he do? He wasn't a soldier. What did he do? He drove something. He drove something. What did he drive in World War I? No. She says that you know it. She says that you know it. What did he drive as a volunteer? It's a bloody job. Okay, new question. Wow. I need to set the bar a little bit lower, I guess.
What's the answer?
The answer is he drove an ambulance. He was an ambulance driver. Besides drinking, what did Hemingway do a lot while he was in Spain? He watched a certain event in an arena. A certain kind of fighting.
Bull fighting?
There you go. Bull. Is that you? No, you need somebody else. Oh, see, I can't give you a second one. I'm trying to find an easy question that's not too easy for the students. You guys couldn't figure out what the Red Sea was red. I'm sure I do have one more question. Let me see if I can come up with one. Okay. colonial question. Woman at Ground Zero by Sidawi takes place in what African, not African country? Yes. Woman at Ground Zero by Sidawi, which I mentioned earlier, is involved in what country in Africa that's kind of not in Africa? Egypt. Yes. There you go. Never read Kafka before. She's got it. When she gives up on Kafka, any of you are welcome to borrow it, because Kafka's really great, but Metamorphosis, if you've never read it, it's worth reading. We've got some time. I know that you guys are thinking that it's 3 o'clock and we're out an hour early. We can't be. Miss Sylvia has me here until 4, and so I'm at the point for Q&A. If you guys still have questions or topics that we really should be talking about. There are a couple of texts that I didn't throw out to you guys, that I didn't talk to you about. What I've been mostly talking to you about are fictions. I've been talking to you, the books that I mentioned, for the most part, we're dealing with colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial novels. But Achebe has written a lot, and you guys have probably read some of the essays, it sounds like some of you are, about, for instance, Achebe's response to Conrad. But if you haven't read or considered reading, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he's written not only memoirs that talk about his childhood and him growing up, and I think he's up to 6 or 7 different memoirs that he's written. But also, there are some real texts that you guys need to play with. I should have made this more of a point. Some texts about what it means to be colonized. So Moving the Center is one of his texts that if you have not read, Moving the Center, and he spells it C-E-N-T-R. Moving the Center. Barrel of a Pen is another one that you need to read. And it talks about how when Chairman Mao said all the power of the world, it comes from the barrel of a gun, he's making a counter argument to that, the barrel of a pen, by Ngugi, N-G-U-G-I. If you haven't read Decolonizing the Mind, that's definitely where I would say is a starting point for you. Decolonizing the Mind. Brilliant texts. Talking about these issues, and it's interesting because the struggle that I have with Ngugi versus Achebe, Ngugi's dead. And so you can look at Ngugi's work and you can say, this is what Ngugi said, or Achebe's dead. You can look at Achebe and say, this is what Achebe said. Surajku. You can say, this is the text and this is it. This was the most recent thing he said before he died. And so that's where his argument kind of ends. With Achebe, or with Ngugi, you start looking at Ngugi's work and you look at it chronologically, his opinions change. You look at his experimentation. Ngugi has tried to write exclusively in Gikuyu. And this was something we haven't talked about either. What happens if you speak exclusively in Indonesian to me? Am I going to understand everything that you say? No. I'm not. If you talk to me quickly and you're using your full vocabulary, you're not going to dumb it down. Mr. Moore, I need to talk to Mr. Moore like a 3-year-old. If you talk to me like you would anyone else, using Bahasa Indonesia, I'm not going to hear all of what you have to say. If you use Bahasa Jawa to me, 1 word, 2 words, that's about it. That's all that I'm going to understand. So you need to speak to me in what language? What if you're trying to speak to me in English about how your culture is equally valuable as mine? There's a disconnect. And this is a disconnect that Ngugi has struggled with, and Chinua Achebe has struggled with, and Soyinka, and most African post-colonial writers have struggled with. If you want your voice to be heard, you need to speak in English, or the definitions that I gave you are the definitions that I use, but they've evolved and changed depending on what scholar you're talking to or about. So working definitions are things that you find are contextualized to one place or one time. But I've done my best to give you the things that I'm most familiar with as an opening. So, questions? Anything else? Yes? It does. And again, this may have been that I've opened a can of worms with this idea that I don't believe that colonialism has ended. Nationalism and colonialism don't have to be separate. You can have colonialism and nationalism incorporating into it. What I'm saying is that the Dutch continue to influence everything from the system of government and the way that the government is established here follows not necessarily a traditional Indonesian tribal model of government, but it follows that. When you guys talk about rubber time, right? That you guys are dealing with rubber time, the perspective on certain times influencing you, it's not always a bad thing to say that no, 3 o'clock means 3 o'clock. And so you guys don't show up for my class late by 15 minutes because, oh, Mr. Moore, this is Indonesia, we're just following our culture. This is why I want you guys to be thinking critically. Is because absolutely nationalism is going to be a thing that Indonesia first. Well, you're saying that, but look at the bottle of Coca-Cola sitting next to the person who's yelling it. Look at the outfit that he's wearing. Look at those kind of elements. I don't think that culture should remain the same because we want it to become better. I want my American culture to be different. I mean, Lord knows that with the President of the United States right now, he's working hard to hopefully do good things. I'll say it that way, diplomatically, because I'm being taped. But I don't want to be the kid that I don't want to be the 5-year-old that I was, 38 years ago. I don't want my culture to remain static. I want them to become better. I want us to become better people. And so culture should evolve, and it will. It has to. It will evolve in positive ways, it will evolve in negative ways, and we'll swing back and forth a little bit. But it's going to be there. It's just a matter of, is it about how we dress? And is that a big deal? How we dress may not necessarily affect the way that we act as much, but it's certainly impacting things. It tells us what we're willing to spend money on, how we're willing to prioritize things, those ideas. But we've got Dutch influences all around. In the most nationalistic places in Indonesia, you've got Dutch buildings, you've got Dutch food, you've got Coca-Cola, you've got McDonald's, you've got all of those things that are shaping. Anything else? Yes?
Why would some people and agents like me say something like, when I have friends, people can say that? Why?
Oh, the reasoning behind?
Yeah.
He's asking about N-I-G-G-E-R. And I don't use that word. We often say the N-word. Because it's impolite. The negative term that we use for African Americans. Why do they use it?
Why we can't use it?
Why can't you use it?
Yeah.
Language is power, right? And I think that there's something to be said for having words that are powerful. There are certain words that we want to only be used in extreme situations to show how serious it is. What you've done is you completely degraded and dehumanized a person. There are certain terms that have been used throughout history over and over again, and never in a positive way. And so they have such a negative connotation to them that this is the worst thing you can do. It's taboo.
Yeah.
Culturally, we say that there are certain things that you would never, ever, ever do.
still though, it's your original was given in Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, I understand where it came from. That it deals with a man who is too frugal, or yeah, it's not a nice man. It's not normally associated with black people in the original context, but it's there.
Somewhat like,
You can't use that word.
yeah, you're allowed to say that word.
All right. Why is it then that a term can be used negatively by one group only and can suddenly be turned positive? Let me use a different example, but one that also has impact. The word queer. What does the word queer mean? Give me a dictionary definition. Queer. Almost. Okay. Unusual is how it was used before. What's the other term, or what's the other way that we use the word queer now? Homosexual. Not necessarily bisexual, but homosexual. Somebody who's queer is attracted to or has relations with somebody of the same sex, right?
Yes.
You can come to the United States and you can get a degree in queer theory. If you study Sastra, you may have studied queer theory approaches to literature. And it's addressing the homosexual experience in literature and the homosexual issues as found in literature. It's not too far from colonialism in a lot of ways. It's talking about an ethnic issue. But one of the things that the homosexual community has done, and this is true with a lot of different communities, is that in order to go ahead and take away the power of that word queer, they've chosen to embrace it. You want to use that term queer on this person, fine. Go ahead and do it. And now, you don't have that power anymore. Because now it's not a negative. If a black person uses another slur on another black person, it can be seen as a term of endearment. If I say, you're an idiot, and you're my best friend, it's a term of endearment, right?
Yeah.
If I don't like you and I say you're an idiot, it's an insult. But it can be twisted around a little bit to change the power dynamic of that word. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what is it. This is the silliest example. In my family, you were not allowed to call someone a jerk. Okay? A jerk was a negative thing. And as a kid, I remember hearing the phrase, well, a jerk is a tug is a boat runs on water, water's nature, nature's beautiful, so thanks for the compliment. And it was a way of twisting that insult into something that was, in a really stupid way, positive. It was a way of changing that around. Well, thank you for saying that about me. Yeah, and you take away the power of the sender. Playing with power dynamics in language is really a fun topic. Getting into how it can be used to control somebody or manipulate someone. Yeah, there's a ton of research into that, and you can dig deep into it. Mark Twain has been banned from a lot of schools in America for using the term Negro. And so it's not uncommon to see people say we can't use that at all because kids won't know how to use it the right way. My son is named after a character from To Kill a Mockingbird, the great American novel. My son is Atticus, and Atticus Finch is the great character, the lawyer who defends a black man in that. To Kill a Mockingbird is all about equality between races. It's about injustice. It's about standing up for what you believe in. It's about a lot of great positive messages. And it's banned because of that one word. Because at the time, when Harper Lee was writing it, that's the term that you would use. So, yeah, cultural context.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Look at that, I stalled this out so you guys aren't a full hour early. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Don't think that any of the problems of the Western civilization have escaped African writers as well. Who was allowed to go to school first in Africa? Men or women? Men. So they had the opportunities to go to school earlier. I don't want to speak to the whole continent, but certainly in certain places, the real success of a man, where I was from in Kenya, living up in northern Kenya, a man who was successful married multiple wives. He married multiple, regardless of his religion, he married multiple wives. He married multiple wives to have lots of children. When you have lots of children, you do less work. Because your wives can work, and your children can work, and you can sit around and you can either write books, or you can spit, or you can carve things out of wood, or you can do whatever you want to do. But there's this absolutely sexism. Read Shamanda, her name is Adichie. I'm just going to use her last name. But pick up Adichie or watch the TED Talk. TED.com. If you guys aren't going to that website on a regular basis, TED.com, TED.com, has some of the best, really typically between 15 and 22-minute speeches in the world about everything. Listen to the Pixar ones from the Pixar writers and directors about how to tell a story. But go to Adichie's as well. I think Emma Watson, Hermione Granger, I think she may have one or two on there as well about sexism. The Superman pose that I was talking about, our positions, it's on there and it's a short one. But there's a lot of good stuff. Adichie is the one that I really like as a new female author. Sidawi was out there beforehand. But the opportunities for women in Africa slowly have caught on a little bit more and have become more popularized. They're struggling. One of the websites I put up from Facebook, I think it was either World Literature Today or the Short Story Africa. They've been talking a lot about transsexual writers and why we haven't heard the voices of transsexual or homosexual writers coming out of Africa. The church has quieted the behavior of homosexuals a lot, so you would not make it known. Governments have restricted homosexuality. It's illegal in a lot of African countries to be homosexual and certainly to act on that behavior. So different groups are not heard. Cherise Kramer-Ray is who you also need to read. And Cherise Kramer-Ray, as a sociologist and an anthropologist, uses the muted group theory. Why is it that women or other groups, their voice is not heard as loudly as men? With women doing the work in Africa, with women suffering the same struggles on top of being women, the childbearing, the child raising, all of those issues, the women being the victims of famine and war in a different way than men have, their voices, they're out there, but when you're raising a child, it's hard to type on your iPad when you've got a child in this arm and you're trying to write over here. So women have that struggle. Again, not African, not Indonesian, not a woman. So I don't want to speak too much to that as if I'm an authority about what it's like to be a woman in a post-colonial country. Anybody else? Communicate. Oh.
So this is about the history classes in your country.
In the U.S.? I don't know what the answer to my country is anymore. So no, but in the U.S. you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
How about the history teachers there? If they are teaching about history and especially about colonialism, how do they place themselves? I mean, how do they put themselves among the students? Do they teach the students to support or to be against colonialism?
The question is whether or not history teachers in the U.S. Take a position and what position they take on colonialism. I don't think there are too many people who would go ahead in the United States who would say, colonialism, those were our glory days, that was great. Most of us look at Manifest Destiny, certainly the genocide committed against the Native Americans, and then the U.S. influence abroad as a pretty negative idea. I'm not the most flag-waving patriot of Americans. America's done a lot of bad things. We've exploited people, we've created genocide, we've certainly contributed to a lot of wars all over the world, but we've done a lot of good things. If you don't know about the Peace Corps, if you want to do something interesting, you might play with positive colonialism. And try to play with, is there ever a time in which colonial control or cultural engineering is a good thing? In the 1960s, John F. Kennedy one of the most celebrated presidents of the United States, launched a program called the Peace Corps. And the idea was we could fight wars all over the world with troops and with guns, or we could start sending out people and doing volunteer diplomacy, essentially. Let's send out doctors throughout the world. Let's send out educators to set up schools. Let's help do medical trainings and talk about healthcare. Let's drain swamps, or at least tell people about how to avoid malaria. And so but that's still a form of colonialism in a lot of ways. It's changing beliefs, values, and attitudes. It's saying, wait a minute, you guys have never used mosquito nets before, but you should. And so let's teach you about mosquito net. And ideas like that. Let's talk about how to stop sexual transmitted diseases. That's certainly a big cultural impact. If you provide condoms for a country, that's a cultural impact. So we've done a lot of bad things. I don't think there are many teachers that we defended, though. The other answer to your question is, sometimes we don't talk about colonialism. In the high schools, in the SMA, SMP, we're as much as we're opening up to world history, we're still pretty Americentric, focused on America first, on those ideas. In the university levels, as we start diversifying and getting specialization, there are people who are talking about it. We're also bringing in African professors to talk about African subjects. We're bringing in global people to talk about subjects. It's hard not to be biased one way or the other. I don't want to be defensive about the white guys colonizing, but at the same time, I don't want to be too overly critical about a time and a place that I'm far removed from. You guys have got some good discussion, and I'm hoping that this leaves. I almost feel bad that it's happening at the end of a semester rather than at the beginning of a new semester where the teachers can be peppered with more questions about, Mr. Moore said this, I disagree with him, tell me that he's wrong. Things like that. I want those things to be able to happen. I want your teachers to be caught up with all of the new ideas and energies that you're going to be putting into your classes. All right. Thank you for letting me come. My family is off at the zoo and touring, and so this is a good experience for them. It's a good experience for me to realize maybe Jakarta is not as terrifying as I thought it was. So thank you. Again, I appreciate it. You guys are smart students and you've got good ideas, and I can't wait to see how you guys develop. Thank you very much.
Okay guys, I think that's all for today. Let's call it a day. So let's thank Jonathan once again, and then I will send you home. Okay, thank you for being here. So and thank you for
Hai Euclidean, saat ini saya sedang bersama Jonathan Moore dari Eastern Illinois University. Saat lagi kita akan menanyakan beberapa pertanyaan kepada beliau. Hello sir, this is Tita. So I have a few questions here that I want to ask. So the first one is, What do you think and what do you know about the transcultural condition in Indonesia?
I think that we're continuing to see a greater acknowledgement that no one is in one culture, but instead that so many Indonesians are realizing that they are moving from culture to culture and their cultures are overlapping. We're no longer talking about one ethnic group or one people group, but we're talking about an interaction and a blending of different groups.
Do you have any recommendation for like transcultural like books or novel for us?
I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that you can be looking at. You can look at the traditional African novels and things like that, but I think we need to reevaluate what's transcultural. If you go back far enough, you'll begin to see that a lot of the novels that we were writing in the 1960s and 1970s, we weren't using the word transcultural, but they're really transcultural novels. They're about everything from East of Eden or John Steinbeck talking about moving from one part of the U.S. to another is a transcultural novel. But we just didn't use the word for it. So going back to those classics and reevaluating them as transcultural makes sense.
Okay, so the next question is, why do you pick Indonesia out or anywhere else to the place that you're living right now?
Speaking quite frankly, I was working with predominantly Muslim college students in Africa, and the political situation got a little challenging within Eritrea, and we were looking for a new opportunity somewhere else in the world that could use a good English teacher, or at least me. And then we ended up realizing that even though I'm used to working with African students, the similarities as global youth, the similarities in terms of their religion and some of their multicultural backgrounds made sense to come to Indonesia. And there were opportunities here to be an educator in Central Java.
Okay, great. So the last question is, what makes you think that us, like all of the English literature students, needs to learn about the post-colonialism and transcultural? I mean, like, what is so important about them?
I think that it's important for anyone to understand who they are and where they came from, and what's influenced their behaviors, and to really be able to effectively understand that they aren't just who their parents said they were. They're not just necessarily an ethnic group that is put on a KTP or an ethnic group that that has celebrated certain traditions, but they can blend those ideas. And people have been effectively in discussion, you know, with Chinua Achebe and Ngugi and African writers and other Asian writers. And so they've already begun to ask those questions that as college students and really everyone goes through as they're trying to grow up and identify what it means to be who we are.
So, okay, that's also. Thank you so much for this time and opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Happy anniversary, UCRIDA, to 50 happy years. My name is Jonathan Moore. Be sure to stay tuned to www.ucrida.tv.
Sekian liputan hari ini. Saya Agustina Dita melaporkan dari UKRIDA TV.